Welcome to This is Oregon, a podcast where we take you inside research happening at the University of Oregon and show you how it applies to your daily life. I'm Layla Okahata, your host for this episode. I'll be talking with Lauren Hallett, a plant ecologist and associate professor in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Oregon. Her research spans across continents, as she has been traveling to places like Australia, Spain, and Argentina to examine how plants coexist in the face of climate change. But here in Oregon, she's working on something close to home, helping filbert farms, also known as hazelnut farms, adapt to warming temperatures. Thanks for joining us, Lauren. Please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Thanks, Layla, so much for having me here. So, hi, I'm Lauren. I'm a professor at the University of Oregon, and I am a plant ecologist, and my work is really focused on making usable science for ecosystem management. And I particularly like to work in working landscapes. My background has been in rangeland ecology, but a lot of my work is focused on finding kind of win-win solutions for biodiversity conservation, but also for agriculture. And lately I have been spending a lot of time studying hazelnut orchards.
Why hazelnuts? What brought you to work on hazelnut orchards?
One of my approaches has always been, but especially this was true when I was starting at the U of O, is just to meet a lot of people, listen to what's going on for them, and then develop science to address their needs. And so I was a first-year professor, and I was trying this approach, and a hazelnut grower reached out to me. And he had a problem, which is that he was growing hazelnuts. He was growing them organically. And a major pest for hazelnuts is this moth that flies around in the summer and then burrows into the nuts. And if you have too many infested nuts, it's not good for anything. And so he was doing a great job managing at this farm, but he had these beautiful oak stands near his property, and the acorns can also be infested by this pest. And so he was concerned about pests coming from his beautiful oak stands and into the hazelnuts. And kind of obvious answer to this problem is that you could cut down the oak stands and then you wouldn't have the pest coming from the oaks. But we didn't want to do that. The Oregon white oak is iconic. It's a kind of a really important species for conservation. And so he came to me because I had a background in grazing and rangeland ecology, and he had pigs. And he said, could we run these pigs through when the moth has infested the acorns? They'll eat the acorns. They'll also eat the moth. That approach means that we can cut down on the pest population coming from the oaks. We can keep our oaks, and we can have really delicious pigs. And so we designed a study to test this. It worked great. We called it a win-win-win for conservation and for agriculture. And I was hooked on hazelnuts ever since.
So that's really cool that you were able to find, like you say, a win-win solution instead of getting rid of the oak trees, you found a way to manage them both at the same time with pigs, which I didn't know could be a pest control. That's really cool. And I'm sure you're aware of this fact, Lauren, but I only recently learned that hazelnuts are actually a big crop in Oregon, where the state produces 99% of the nation's hazelnuts.
Yeah.
As I come from Los Angeles and I moved here last year, I was like, whoa, I didn't even know that. So it was a really cool thing to learn about. And so what are some of the ecological challenges you saw hazelnuts facing here in Oregon that you want to help address?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that hazelnuts are in many ways a huge win for sustainability and just for Oregon. They are delicious and they're really good for you. And ecologically, they don't need too much water. Sometimes they don't need to be irrigated at all. They're perennial plants, so they don't require the soil to be tilled. And they're also trees, which means that they're just great for carbon storage. And so it's a really great crop to have here in Oregon. They do have a few sustainability challenges that folks are working on. First, they have a lot of pests, and that means that people often use a lot of pesticides, although there's some really great research going on, especially at OSU, on alternatives. Second, the nuts are harvested off the ground, which means that many growers use herbicide and mowing and then scraping of the ground to have a bare and smooth ground for harvest. And the combination can mean that there's a lot of chemical inputs, and then there's a lot of runoff of both the chemicals and often of the soil erosion. So this becomes a problem for public health, but it's also a problem for the long-term sustainability of the orchards because we don't want them to be losing all their good, rich soil. And then finally, climate shocks like the heat dome in June of 2021 can be really hard on orchards, especially on baby trees. And so increased heat waves and drought going into the future will challenge the sustainability of the industry overall.
Tell me more of then how you're addressing those problems.
Yeah, so our work right now is focused on these last two issues, thinking about soil health and preventing erosion, and then also thinking about making orchards more resilient to climate shocks. And what we've been doing is we've been developing cover crop mixes, and we're especially using mixes that use native plants to help improve the soil and reduce runoff and erosion. And having plants on the ground also lowers the temperature of the soils, which is really important as we look towards future heat waves.
Can you explain a little bit to our listeners who may not be familiar what cover crop mixes are or what cover crops are?
Yeah. So cover crops are crops that are grown to protect the soil for the cash crop. And so in an annual system, they would often be used in the winter after the crop has been harvested. In orchard systems like hazelnuts, they're grown between the rows of trees to help stabilize that soil that would otherwise be bare ground.
You mentioned earlier you're specifically working with native cover crops. What are those, and how do those differ from conventional cover crops?
So a lot of conventional cover crops are developed for annual cropping systems. And the idea is that they're going to grow fast and they're going to grow big. And so that helps cover the soil between the cash crops, and it adds a lot of organic material and plant material into the soil. But that's could be a problem for orchards, right? Because they're perennial systems, you don't want to have a lot of growth during periods of time when you're harvesting. And so cover crops that might work really well in other systems might end up growing when you're harvesting off the ground, and then the plant material can be capturing those nuts and impeding harvest. Native plants, on the other hand, grow on the right timeline. So they're adapted to the Mediterranean climate that we have here in Oregon. And that means that they start growing in the fall, but they stay pretty small. So they're there in the fall and the winter. They're helping to stabilize the soil, but they're not massive. They get big in the spring, and that means that they're putting a lot of plant material into that they're building up plant material, and it's getting incorporated into the soil in the spring. And they're also big, so they're suppressing weeds that would otherwise be problems at harvest too. So they're doing all that growth then, and then the summer comes, and they're used to our really hot, dry summers. The way they handle it is they die. And so if they're perennials, they die back. If they're annuals, they die completely. And so by the time you get to the fall harvest, you don't see them. It looks like a bare orchard floor, but you had all those plants growing at critical moments when you needed them throughout the year.
So where did you get the idea to use native cover crops then, and how did this project take off?
So my first project, back with the pigs and the oaks and the pests, we had a lot of undergraduate researchers that were driving that work. And one of them that joined for that project was an undergraduate, Marissa Lane Massey, but she was also a fourth-generation hazelnut farmer. And she's also a plant nerd. And so we were, looking at these orchards, we were getting, excited about developing these types of relationships and science in the orchards. And she said, hey, if we look at this system, where the oaks are, we don't have much of a native plant understory. It's all invaded. And in trying to bring back those native plants is a big challenge. Over in the orchards, there's bare ground. They might actually do well. Like, our native plants are adapted to disturbance. They historically have been burned on a frequent basis. And so while mowing and scraping is not indigenous burning, it's a disturbance nonetheless that our plants could maybe handle. And if we bring those native plants into the hazelnut orchards, we might be increasing their populations, but it could be doing a lot of good for the orchards themselves for all these reasons that we've talked about stabilizing the soil when you need it to be stabilized and not being there when you don't want plants there.
So you and Marissa had this idea. What did you do about it?
So we thought, okay, let's test this. And so it was Marissa and a bunch of other members of the lab, but Marissa was a big engine. And we said, okay, well, where could we test this? Marissa is a fourth-generation hazelnut grower. So we said, hi, Marissa's parents, could we trial this at your property? And they very kindly let us try it out. And our goal was first just to see, would native plants survive in the orchard, right? Like, if they didn't, end of story. But they did. And so we found the native plants, they could handle the mowing that happens at the orchards, and they would come back They could handle the scraping, so they basically bring a ground scraper to keep the ground level. The native plants could handle it. It turns out, though, you didn't even really need to scrape so much when they were there because the plants kept the ground more even, and so they didn't have to do that management action. It made their lives a little easier to not. And we did a one-time seeding, and 5 years later, those plots still look beautiful. The native plants are still kicking despite and often even because of the orchard management that's happening.
That's really cool that Marissa's parents allowed you guys to test this on their farm. What was their reaction to it?
So I think at first it might have been kind of parents indulging a daughter, and as parents sometimes do. But then they started to think that the flowers were really beautiful. And, once we had established that the plants could survive in the orchard, our next goal was to say, okay, now let's measure every parameter that might matter to them as the people who are managing this orchard and are depending on its production. And so some of the things we tested is we looked at how do these native plants do in terms of affecting the water availability. You could say having more plants there might compete with the trees for water, but having more plants there might put more organic material, help the soil hold water and help water infiltrate. We found basically there was no difference on soil moisture, so those things pretty much balanced out. We then looked at weed suppression, right? And so growers put a ton of effort into keeping weeds that would be growing during harvest and keep entangling their nuts. And what we found is if we did diverse mixes of wildflowers, they really kept those weeds at bay. So we didn't need that type of management. So we kind of tested that side of things. And then I think the thing that really impressed everybody, so Marissa's parents, me, Marissa, and the rest of the team was 2 falls ago. It was really wet, and the ground was muddy, and in a lot of the more conventionally managed areas of their orchards, the nuts were getting pushed into the ground, and so the harvester would come over, but the nuts were so plugged into the mud that the harvester didn't pick them up. But over in the areas where we'd been trialing these native plants, there was the root structure from the plants that was helping to maintain that soil. So even though there wasn't much growth above ground, everything that was happening with the plants below ground meant that the orchard floor was flat. They could pick up the nuts, and we had much better harvesting rates in that wet fall in our beautiful native plots than we did in conventional. And that for me was kind of a turning point where it had started from just this kind of neat idea that was maybe of kind of niche interest to people that like native plants, to saying, okay, actually this might be of interest to the wider, grower community. And so that's when we decided that we should, try to scale it up and see how it performed across, different types of farms with different soil, with different management activity and so forth. And so we wrote a grant and we got a grant. It's a conservation innovation grant through the Natural Resource Conservation Services. And that supports this work. We're going to be building up to having 20 farms throughout the valley and kind of test out what their experiences are like with this native cover crop.
I agree that it is really cool how it did start as kind of just an undergrad's idea, and now it's becoming something growing and hopefully to something to be applied across the state. With now that you mentioned there's 20 partner farms that you're working with, and so
there will be.
Okay,
but we're building.
Nice. So will be. How did you reach out to these farms, and what are their thoughts so far too?
So I would say that there's reaching out about the grant, but there's also just how we've engaged with farms throughout the process. And I would say that the approach that we've tried to take is to go to as many grower events and just show up as much as we can and just listen at first. We're this, rangeland ecology lab from the University of Oregon, right? Like you need to show up and hear what people are doing for a while before you start saying, hey, try this, right? And so we started by kind of going to those meetings, getting to know people, and we made some mistakes along the way, but I think we showed up enough that people realized we were there with really good faith, and going to different farms and just hearing what their issues were. And so that was how we started to build with the community. And it was invaluable to have someone like Marissa who can speak both of the languages, right? Like she's She is a grower. She's been in that world her whole life, and she's also a scientist, and she thinks a lot about conservation, and she can really liaison and say, this is something growers would need, or Lauren, that idea is completely not practical. Let's move on. And there's a trust there. I would say then our next goal was, okay, if we have these ideas, let's test them in a way that we have some basis to think that they might be helpful for people before we talk about them too much. And so it was great to have, Marissa's parents that were willing to kind of let us trial things in kind of a safe space. And, starting to go big once we had a sense that this might be promising. And then the last thing I would say is that we've really tried to make sure that we can bring the resources for this type of work that it wouldn't be reasonable to expect a grower would do right away, right? Like when you're developing new practices that are kind of especially new conservation practices for agriculture, farmers, their lives are very full. They're also really full of challenges. Like, you don't want to say anything that's like, this might take more of your time or might take more of your money. But if you can come in as a partner and say, hey, I've got this grant, it's going to cover all of these costs. We have some preliminary results that say it might be promising, and we can help with the implementation. Well, then you create an environment that is not creating work for them, and it's allowing them to try something where the risk is taken off of them and move towards us. And that's a way to really start kind of building these partnerships and these kind of engaged scientific experiments at a larger scale.
I love that this is research that includes both scientists and farmers to develop that scientist-farmer relationship, and especially having Marissa, who, as you mentioned, is both a scientist and a farmer, having that meld is just really cool and really great. And so that way, this research does address farmers' needs and their farms' needs. Besides planting native cover crops, are there other practices you're helping hazelnut growers adopt?
Yes. Well, adopt is a strong word because I think we're trialing this to see if they'd even want to adopt it. But this one is a newer idea for us. But we've started trialing basalt dust amendments as a replacement for liming in orchards. And so a lot of our soils are too acidic. And so it's pretty routine for growers to apply lime to their soils to raise the pH. And basalt dust should, and we've found that it does, do the same thing, that applying basalt dust will raise the pH to levels that are better for the orchards. But basalt dust amendments, instead of liming, are also a potential natural climate solution. So the idea here is that basalt rock, as it weathers, forms a chemical reaction in which it draws CO2 from the atmosphere and fixes it as calcium carbonates. And those calcium carbonates enter the water stream and eventually make their way to the ocean, where they should ideally stay put. And so, on a very slow scale, as basalt weathers, it's sequestering carbon. But if you crush that basalt into dust, you could accelerate this weathering process. And so really creating a lot of different surface area for the basalt to weather and really pull down this CO2 from the atmosphere. And Oregon is a great place to capitalize on this idea because we have the Columbia Plateau. It supplies a lot of basalts, and the dust actually can be acquired just as a byproduct of mining. So it's there and it's nearby. So even though it's heavy, we don't have to ship it too far. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has viewed basalt dust amendments as potentially one of the most powerful natural climate solutions, but also the one with the biggest uncertainty. We don't know how viable this practice would be. It really seems like, in kind of in situ trials, it can sequester a lot of carbon, but is that offset by transportation costs? Does that carbon really stay once it's does it make it to the ocean and so forth? And so this is something that is a hot research question right now. And we're a really relevant place to test it. And so in collaboration with my colleague at the U of O, Professor Lucas Silva, we've been trialing their use in orchards.
Are you testing this also on Marissa's family farm?
Yes. Her parents are very indulgent. So that was our first place to trial. And I think for all of these, the first question is, will it work? Like, can you even do it? And the second question is, does it do what the growers need it to do, right? And so the first thing we did was say, how easy is it to apply? And the answer is it's really easy. You use the same equipment that you use to spread lime. And so it's, from a management perspective, it's a one-to-one replacement. And then we saw, we were out there monitoring what was happening with the pH of the soil. And really quickly, we saw the pH going up to desirable levels. And so far we've shown that it seems like it works for growers. And now the open question is, can we really test what's happening with that kind of carbon life cycle? And does this work for everyone? Does it work with all different types of soil types? Or, is the effect we're seeing kind of unique to this one farm?
What does it look like to spread basalt dust on an orchard farm? Like, what does the basalt dust look like? And is it just like a black dust on trees? I'm actually curious what that looks like.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. No. So the dust, you want it to go on the ground.
Oh, okay. That makes more sense.
So it is kind of a black gray dust, but it spreads. You try to keep it on the ground rather than on the trees. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So I should clarify, it is a soil amendment.
Ah, I see. So
Yes.
it helps with the soil. And as you mentioned earlier, when basalt gets weathered, that chemical process sequesters carbon from our atmosphere. And that way it's kind of, in a way, addressing carbon pollution. So it's a climate mitigating alternative to lime.
Exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So, lime does one thing really well. It affects the soil pH. And the idea is maybe the basalt dust could do both, the pH regulation and also bring this climate component.
And when you're planting these alongside the native cover crops, which those, blanket the ground, help protect the soil and therefore the trees from heat and soil erosion. I love how you describe your work as a win-win solution. And so this does sound like a win-win solution, but what are the current barriers preventing this from becoming standard agricultural practice?
The cost. Definitely the cost. I mean, first, for some of this, it's so nascent that you have to have your research partners take on, some of those trials before a grower would say, oh yeah, I'll do this thing that no one's ever done before, right? Like that's generally not the safest strategy. So for both of these, native seeds are expensive. Like native seeds come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, which I think is beautiful from like a diversity of life perspective. But it's really challenging from an agricultural perspective where if you want to cultivate and harvest seeds on a large scale, it's difficult with native seeds. So we're working on that. We're trying to reduce seed application rates. We're trying to see if we can harvest seeds from the plots. We're finding that the harvester that picks up the hazelnuts, they then blow air as the hazelnuts drop to push away debris so that they don't collect the debris. And we're finding that's actually also really effective at pushing seeds out and helping the seeds spread across the orchard. And so we're trying to see about, can we change the configuration of how we seed so we can minimize the amount of seed we need and maximize the area. So we're working on that, but it is still expensive. And for now, and I would imagine for a long time, the viability of the practice will require partnerships between interested growers and conservation-focused organizations that will subsidize the seed cost. There's also a cultural component. To a lot of growers, they like the aesthetic of a bare and clean orchard floor. And so, when I say, well, native plants flowering in orchards are beautiful, it's a perfect example of beauty in the eye of the beholder, right? Like to me, they are, but tastes vary, and there is that cultural component too. For the basalt dust amendments, it is also more expensive than liming, although the delta is not nearly so great as for the native seeds. But it's also really new, and so growers are asking for more information about how it would affect the soil and tree nutrient concentrations. And they're asking about whether the dust application would affect air quality and their health as they're out there managing the orchard. So those are some open questions that we're aiming to test.
So it still might be some time before this becomes a widely applied practice, right?
Yeah. In a couple of years, we'll have 20 farms doing it, and then we'll see how it goes for them and where we go from there.
Where are we going from here? What's next?
Okay, well, I hope this doesn't sound like a cop-out because I mean it very sincerely. But I in this work, I don't know. Like I don't think I can foresee what the next research questions are. I don't tend to have a plan of like, I'll do this and I will do this and I will do this. And I think the plan is much more like how we do the work. And so right now our next steps are to keep expanding these trials, but then we want to hear from growers what their experiences are and what worked for them and what didn't, and what could we do that would, maybe be of, greater interest, and have our next big ideas come from that process. So far, that process has been working for me. I think we've identified some really cool and interesting potential pathways for these kind of conservation and production partnerships. And so my non-cop-out answer is, I don't know, but that's the point.
Is there anything I neglected to ask that you would like to share with our listeners?
I think I have one last point about just cover crops in general. And I am a huge fan of native cover crops. I come from this kind of conservation angle, but there's no one right cover crop. And I think this is really true. The native cover crops do well in some environments, but there's also going to be orchards where you just want to build up that organic matter really quickly. And maybe then some of those more conventional ones work better. Or maybe you're on a slope and you want to have just a creeping grass that can cover that ground all of the time to help with your erosion rather than, just in the winter and spring, right? And so while a lot of our tact has been trying to build up these native species as cover crops, we're also trialing other kind of like best case, more affordable, conventional, but maybe, also unconventional but cultivated species that could help fill this matrix of, different reasons to have cover crops, different needs, different constraints, and have the native cover crops and some of these alternatives being kind of co-developed to help fill in that landscape.
So you're not trying to find just one native cover crop mix that works on all farms, but really looking at each farm, if one is on a hill, or what if the soil is a little bit different, or what if we're in a shaded region, trying to find the native cover crop mix that works best for that farm and personalize it.
That native cover crop mix, and I don't want to undercut myself because I love the native cover crops, but also what cover crop mix in general. And so, we're really open to kind of trying different species. Maybe they're, cultivated species that have been used in this context, or maybe they're ones that haven't been used, but oh my gosh, this actually would be a pretty good fit for this type of system. And so I kind of view the native cover crop research as in tandem with a larger body of research on cover crops that is kind of looking for, what types of species are most effective for growers, and, also for kind of, larger goals. And sometimes that's conservation, or sometimes it's just stabilize that hillside right now, and who the species are and whether or not they're native and which ones are right for which particular job is really going to vary. And so I don't know, maybe I guess I'm ending this by undercutting my thesis of like, yay, we don't all this native cover crop research, but just kind of ending with, we're doing cover crop research in general to try to make sure that we meet, people's needs.
Well, thank you for joining us on the podcast, Lauren.
Thank you so much for having me, Layla.
This is Oregon is produced by the Division of University Communications. For more of the latest University of Oregon research and news, visit news.uoregon.edu or find us on your favorite social media platform using the handle @uoregon. Thanks for listening, and go Ducks!